This is about social innovation. We're social innovators. I'm going to, I don't know you here, but I'm going to assume that everybody in this room, somewhere in their mind, wants to devote their lives or careers towards engaging with the world and making it better. We're not at the business school. We're not at the law school. We're at a school where people who come through here see their role in life as contributing in some way, in some form, to the greater good. I'm generalizing. It may not be true of all of us, but I assume it's true of most of us in this room. So in light of that, I think David asked me to come here because, yes, I've created a nonprofit. You'll learn as you meet other people, or you probably already know this, that each social innovator or each nonprofit, it comes from a different place, and no two stories are the same. But hopefully, in telling you my story and telling the story of the Marshall Project, there are some larger themes that we can learn and draw on. But I am going to start very personal and tell you a little bit about myself and my background and amplify some of what David said, and then get down to the nitty-gritty of how the hell do you start a $5 million nonprofit from scratch, and take it from there. So David's right. I started life as a journalist. I, from a very early age, I was obsessed with politics in the world. I grew up in the 60s and 70s during the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War. In 1974, when I was in high school, I did a documentary film about the Boston busing crisis. There was a court-ordered mandate to desegregate Boston schools, Boston being in the north. This is several years after the Civil Rights Movement. And lo and behold, many of the whites in Boston reacted very unkindly to the forced busing, and there were riots, and it was quite amazing to see people throwing stones at buses with black kids in them in 1974. I say 1974 as being somewhat of a modern era. So we went down there, and I realized the power, and we did a documentary. We showed it around schools. We were kids. But I realized very early the power of journalism and the power of storytelling to influence. So while I wanted to engage in the world, I didn't choose a path of nonprofit, philanthropy. I became a journalist. I was probably imbued with this romance of the field. There really is nothing more enjoyable. I've done a few things now than being in a big city paper and being on top of a big story. And I eventually found myself at the Wall Street Journal. And David's right, I covered real estate. I'm going to leave the Trump thing open to questions, but in the early 90s, I broke all the major stories about Donald Trump's financial collapse, which did take place, and he's written about me in his book, said of all the reporters who ever covered me, none was as malicious as Neil Barsky, the Wall Street Journal. And there's a long story, and I've written about it in the New York Times last August, and you can look it up if you like. But I'm happy to talk about that a little. It's actually a very painful subject because having dealt with Trump extensively 20, 25 years ago, to see him in the White House is particularly personally painful. But we can get into that. But that's marginally relevant here, as well as I'm going to get to. So anyway, I was in journalism, but I didn't hit the ground running like a lot of people, and I ended up being a business reporter. It wasn't what I dreamed of, but that's where the jobs were. I went to the Wall Street Journal, did well, fast forward. By my mid-30s, I decided I'd done what I wanted to do in journalism, and for various reasons, I became an analyst, a Wall Street, a sell-side analyst at a Wall Street firm, and then several years later started a hedge fund, and then was very successful at it and retired in 2009. And what I found interesting about that period, now that I look back, so say from 1993 to 2009, it was my finance career. For the first 5 or 7 years, I didn't read a book that wasn't about finance. I really dove in. I didn't know anything about the financial world, and I really had to sort of put blinders on. And imagine my shock, and this is true, about 4 or 5 years ago, I think I saw a 60 Minutes segment on a massacre in Serbia that had taken place in 91, 92. I'm not even sure of the year. And it was going through it and everything. And I said, where was I during that period? Like, I had totally zoned out. And I assume there's many things that I just zoned out on because I was so focused on what I was doing and being on Wall Street and being successful and all that stuff. And I like to say, people who maybe not from the financial world, I don't think I was doing anything bad then, but I wasn't doing anything good either. I was working hard and doing well. But I don't feel I didn't feel like that should be the capstone of my career or my life. So in 2009, I shut down the hedge fund. I did a documentary film. I taught college a little bit. And then I was kind of fortunate. I didn't need to go back to work. and I could do anything I wanted. So I just decided to just re-engage with the world. Now, I don't want to exaggerate, I'd always been somewhat engaged, but I decided to just do a deep dive into things. And I live in New York City, and I had the fortune, I could meet people. I could meet, people in the charter school movement, or criminal justice, or homelessness, people who had been devoting their lives. And much like in this town, there's thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of people who are dedicated to doing amazing things. And what I realized, number one, is I didn't need to replicate that. I didn't need, I'm not a, in terms of, when we're going to talk about criminal justice, I'm not an attorney. Okay. So lo and behold, I did sort of realize that criminal justice and what we call mass incarceration was one of those things that had kind of crept up on me, like the massacres in Serbia that were taking place while I was sort of ultra-focused on my career without me really noticing. So from the mid-'80s, I think, to 2009, our prison population had gone up 8-fold. Crime was plummeting, but what was happening? Well, in this state, we had 3 strikes you're out. So sentences that would have been for crimes that would have been for 3 to 5 years became 8, 10, 25 years. There were lives just wasting away in prison. And that was the main cause of the larger sentences, which was the larger population, which was greater sentences. It wasn't more people getting arrested. They were just staying in prison for a long time. I was learning a lot about people who are falsely incarcerated. I was learning about police brutality or brutality within prisons. Obviously, the racial disparities and the racism that exists in the system, and on and on and on. And I won't say I was oblivious to this, but I would actually say I was pretty close to never thinking about it up until 2012 and 2013. And I'm not proud of that point, but it's reality. And all of a sudden I realized, like, I had discovered something, but of course I hadn't, because there were all these, if you're involved in the system, you know what's going on. And if you're an advocate, you know what's going on. But there was, at that time, relatively little being written about. There's a book called The New Jim Crow, which I recommend to you, which had just come out. I read it. It influenced me a lot. And the basic thesis of The New Jim Crow, if you don't know, it's written by a law professor named Michelle Alexander, is that mass incarceration, as she defines it, is really the third phase of slavery, right? The third phase of American oppression against African Americans, first being slavery, the next being the Jim Crow system, and the final being mass incarceration. And that was like just a whack on the cheek for me. And there's a lot I would take issue with in the book, but it really awakened me. And I said, so what's amazing is not the reality, and the reality is pretty stark. What's amazing is that there's absolutely no sense of urgency about this issue. So if you think about, again, you can say that about a number of things, but this was particularly stark. If you think about, hunger or a hurricane or other things, you have to act. And then if you think about things like when people run for president, they would have to have a position on taxes, they'd have to have a position in the Middle East, they'd have to position on immigration, let's say, but never on mass incarceration, never on criminal justice. It was really never spoken. It was a political sort of hot potato. So what I concluded was not so much the reality is bad, because I can't say that I had an idea of how to change the reality, but what we needed was to take this issue and elevate it to a matter of national urgency, a matter of national concern. Everything I'm saying today is going to sound very grandiose and maybe even egocentric, because you have to have I had run a hedge fund, I got used to, and I wasn't like this when I was younger, but I got used to thinking big, which is always a very good idea when you're talking about these things. And so I said, we need, with the next presidential election, which was actually in 2016, so it turned out, we need the candidates to be talking about this. How do we do this? And so let's go back to my roots. I'm a journalist. Now, journalism is a very tricky profession, particularly now where it's under assault and things like that, but it always has been. Because people in this room, again, I'm generalizing and apologize in advance, I think maybe advocates. You believe something, you want to work towards changing it. That's very straightforward, and there's nothing wrong with that. If you told a journalist that he or she was an advocate, they would, oh no, we're objective, we're fair, we're truth seekers. And you can be driven crazy talking to people who pretend that there's absolutely no ideological basis or no social basis to what they do. All they want is the truth. Having said that, I would say it's a pretty valid pursuit. And there's more to it than meets the eye, because if you are perceived as an advocate you have certain inroads. And if you're perceived as a journalist, you have other access. And I'll give you an example. So the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR. We are now a journalism organization. I'm fast forwarding a little. And we partner. We're small. People don't really know us. Now they do. Maybe this room will someday. But we can partner with, we can write things and they'll appear in the Washington Post or the New York Times or be an NPR or the New Yorker. And that's because we're perceived, rightly, as being, not being advocates, by being truth seekers. And so if you ask me what the difference between an advocate and a journalist is, or an advocate and I'm not saying one is better at all, but a good journalist is somebody who has a question and seeks an answer and lets the evidence dictate that. And we can argue a lot about this because certainly journalists have biases, and I'm not saying that it's a pure pursuit of intellectual, clarity. However, I felt that with all the advocates out there, and with me not being an attorney, and with my background in journalism and my appreciation for what the power of journalism, I decided that if I wanted to address the mass incarceration issue, a nonprofit journalism outfit would be the best. And if you think back to recent American history, and you think about where journalism has had an impact, think of the Vietnam War. Think of the impact of having television cameras in Vietnam and bringing the war home, and the impact it had on public opinion. Or think about the civil rights movement. And if you saw the movie Selma, or if you're just familiar with what took place, there were massive amounts of freedom rides and demonstrations down south well before the Selma March. But when the marchers were marching over the bridge and there were reporters there to chronicle that and shoot the word up north, it led to a greater federal outrage and ultimately, as you know, the dispatching of federal troops. So in both cases, I think journalism had a very important impact on framing public opinion. Now, were these people advocates? Well, they all had opinions. And I would assume most were against the war and most were reasonably in favor of what was happening in terms of the civil rights movement. But they didn't see their jobs as advocates. They saw their jobs as reporting. And it's a very important distinction here and out there. When I go out to raise money for the Marshall Project and I have to explain to people that we are nonpartisan, what the hell does that mean? Aren't you against mass incarceration? And that's a conversation you have with funders, which I'm going to get to, which is an incredibly important component of every organization that is not for-profit, including ours. So anyway, I decided that that would be the mission, and I hired somebody to do an editorial plan for me, and then we got very lucky. I reached out to somebody named Bill Keller, who had been the editor of the New York Times, and he was a columnist for the New York Times. I had this inkling that he might be restless. He was, sort of the later part of his career. I'd never met him. I reached out to him, well, I'm starting this nonprofit, would you be interested in being editor? And over a few conversations, he said, sure. So that really put us on the map. When he left the New York Times, it was like page 1 of the business section, and away we went. So, okay, so now we have an editor, we have me, and we have a budget. What do you do from there? Well, you call somebody like David, who is at Atlantic Philanthropies, and you say, we got to find, I got a budget of $5 million. That's 28 people, that's an office space, that's, travel expenses, it's, what do we do? I was in a position to put up some of the money, but basically we had to go out and raise it. So I don't know how familiar you are with this world, but there's a vast world of philanthropy, MacArthur Foundation, Ford Foundation, Atlantic Philanthropies. There's just an article in the New York Times, Silicon Valley, all these Silicon Valley billionaires, from Mark Zuckerberg to Laurene Powell Jobs, who is the late Steve Jobs' wife or widow. There's massive philanthropy, wealthy people who, often for tax reasons, take their money, create a foundation, get a deduction, not always, and then they can give that money out, and they have it's a tax advantage way of affecting the world, and it's critically important. And then you have individuals. And I would go around New York City with people I knew and people who were, so eventually we raised the money, and we started hiring. We actually started hiring before we raised the money, confident that we would raise the money, and thankfully we did. And away we went. So, okay, now we're a journalism organization. We start publishing. Well, in journalism, it's a little hard these days. I don't know if you know. I think you do. The whole world is contracting. 25 years ago, you'd have a newspaper, a magazine, you'd have subscribers. And now, because of the digital age, everything is distributed digitally. And it's much harder to get an audience. I mean, what do people read here? Like, how do people in here tend to get their news? off your Facebook tweet when people are posting, or do you read the LA Times or the Guardian, or is it BuzzFeed, or how in general do you guys consume? How do you know what's going on? Just shout it out. Talk show hosts like CNN. Oh, okay, Bill Maher, John Oliver. BBC. LA Times. Anybody? Anybody? Apple News. So that's an aggregator. So Apple News would be an aggregator. And okay, it's very funny because 30 years ago, 40 years ago, people in this room or your parents would all say evening news. Like every day at 6:30, the country more or less would sit down and have the same source of news, whether it was CBS or NBC or ABC. Now the world is fragmented. You have cable news, obviously MSNBC, CNN, Fox, etc. So it's very hard, even in this room, no two people said the same thing. So how do we find an audience? And how do we have an impact? Because ultimately, remember what I said, the point of this is to elevate this issue to one of national urgency. How the hell do you do that? Well, one way is get a lot of publicity, which we did. When we started, we were written up everywhere. Bill Keller leaving the New York Times was a big deal, and I made a lot of noise, and that was very helpful. We were able to get a good, talented staff. And then, guess what? There's so many amazing stories you could be writing about criminal justice. So our first story was about a guy that had been executed in Texas in early 2000s for this horrible crime of lighting his house on fire and incinerating his 3 daughters. And he was executed claiming to his death that he was innocent. And there was a lot of DNA evidence that suggested he was. And we found a jailhouse snitch who was the basis of a lot of the conviction, who claimed that the prosecutors had paid for his education, had basically bought him off. And this was never disclosed. And so in the United States, there's never been a case of somebody who's been executed who was fully exonerated. In other words, have we ever executed an innocent man or woman? Of course we have. But there's never been a case where it's universally agreed to. And this is the case that the guy's name is Todd Willingham, where it came closest. And that was on page 1 of the Washington Post. And months later, I was at some friend's house, and their kid was a clerk for one of the Supreme Court justices. And apparently the justice said something like, hey, that's a pretty active Monday we had today, because everybody was reading that story. I mean, that blew my mind, that we're writing a story about a death penalty case that's being read by 9 justices, or 8 or 7 or 6. But in terms of impact, did that have long-term impact? I bet it does, but I can't measure it. I can't prove it to you. But anyway, so we went on our way, and we've had a lot of success. We did an investigation into Attica Prison. Attica is a notorious upstate New York prison, which had a horrible uprising in the early 70s, where the guards, the state troopers stormed it and killed like 70 prisoners. About a guy that was beaten within an inch of his life by guards for supposedly yelling out an expletive in the middle of the night, which he probably hadn't done. And his life was saved by a nurse in the prison who said, I can't, this guy has to go to a hospital. And so we told the story of his story, and these 3 guards eventually were pled guilty to assault. And today there's cameras in the corridors of the Attica Prison. So in order to prevent something like this happening. This guy ended up getting released. He said he wanted to be a barber. Somebody read his story, a lawyer in New York. And I had forgotten about him, and I hadn't thought about him. And then last week I was meeting with somebody who's an advocate for a criminal justice advocate that deals with families of people who are incarcerated. And I saw this guy, George Williams, was on our board. And I said, that name sounds familiar. She goes, yeah, that's the guy you wrote about in the article. I said, what's he doing now? She says, he's cutting hair. And he's got a profession. He's got a barbershop in New Jersey. And that wouldn't have happened without the Marshall Project. So when we talk about impact, I'm not a scholar, but the Talmud says you save a life, you save the world. So there's saving a life or changing a life, and then there's changing the world. So sometimes you have to take those small victories, and can be just as powerful as when you do something that is much more grand. But anyway, so we've been publishing about 3 years. We won a Pulitzer Prize for an incredible story, which is not really about criminal justice reform. It was about a woman, and I'm curious if people here have heard of this, because this had like 5 million hits. This was a woman who was in Washington State who was raped, a young woman. I think she was 18 or 19. And in this course of telling about the rape, she got the story screwed up, and she eventually rescinded it, and she was sort of confused, and the cops really bungled it, and they eventually arrested her because she had falsely accused this person of rape. And guess what happened? The rapist went on to rape again and again and again. And eventually, this was a story about her own tragedy and police work that eventually nailed this guy, and it really spoke to how do we deal with victims, and how do we deal with, what's the right way to react when you're a victim of a crime. And this story was used a lot now by police, and just sort of how police should respond when women report sexual assaults, and this is going to be made into a movie. So the writers of that won a Pulitzer Prize. And we recently wrote another story, which I think is interesting, is also, again, I'm supposed to talk, I think, about the large social impact we're having. I'm talking about the smaller things, but this may be a larger issue. We did a story that was published also in the New York Times about somebody named Michelle Jones. She was from California, a horrible crime that led to the death of her child, and she was in prison for 20-something years. And while in prison, she went to the library, became interested in learning and scholarship, and she became really a very competent historian, and she was accepted to Harvard. And she was going to be attending Harvard this fall. And then it got out what her crime was. And word got out, and buzz, and then Harvard rescinded her acceptance. And now she's at NYU. But this was an incredible story about how do we reconcile, how can people change, and what is compassion, and how do you rebuild your life, and what is enough time for and we're hoping she cooperates on something, because they want to do books and movies, because I think it will. One of the things I want to do through the Marshall Project, what I think needs to be done, is we need to change how we think about people who are incarcerated or about people who go to prison. And it's not only legislation and sentencing, it's also just how we deal with people when they come out, and really to humanize them and to understand and help people understand that we're not defined by the worst thing we've ever done, et cetera. Anyway, this was a very powerful. Has anyone ever heard that story? Did it? Fabulous. So do you know how or where? It's fine. I mean, it's just, I'm very, I was actually in a foreign country when this happened, and all of a sudden, I'm trying to avoid the news and the world, and all of a sudden I sit down and get these emails, amazing story. But anyway, so from time to time, we're able to do these high impact stories that really affect how the world works. I want to talk a little, though, about just the mechanics of building a nonprofit. It's not as sexy as journalism, but I think it's probably every bit as important, because it's probably the hardest, everything I've done, it's probably the hardest element of everything we've achieved. Because I found, and again, I was in business for 15 years, and hopefully I learned something. And what I think I learned was that, and this is totally relevant to social entrepreneurship, is that great ideas are relatively easy to come up with. Relatively. If we all sat down and wrote 3 ways, or 3 ways we could change the world, I'm sure we could write down amazing practical things. And this is true in business. Let's have an app to do this. Let's have an app to do that. The hardest thing to do is execute, is to follow through. And I, personally, I'm always pretty good with ideas, and it's much harder to execute. It's much harder to get through things done. It's so sexy to talk about something and have a fantasy about something, and it's much more difficult to write 50 emails and have 40 of them ignored, and then 5 of them turn you down, and then you get 3 meetings, and it's a lot of work and a lot of rejection. And so what we did, and what I think I'm probably, not proud is the word, but what I think was the most remarkable thing we did, is that we were able, with this idea, and with a very high-profile editor, which certainly didn't hurt, we were able to build what I think is a sustainable organization. Well, you never know. We're only 3 years old, but we've built a great board. We've built. We have probably 1,000 funders. Most of them are quite small, and they're $5 and $10. We have foundations. I don't know if you're familiar with Atlantic Philanthropies, but where David worked, but it was one of the more extraordinary philanthropical organizations in the history of the world. This was a man, his name was Chuck Feeney. He did very well in business, and he chose to give all his money away while he was still alive, which is extraordinarily rare. Usually people want to hang on to it for as long as they can, because whatever people tell you, they think you can take it with you. But he had something which was truly innovative, which is, no, I want to see the results, and I don't want to speak for him, but he did something, and he did it anonymously. Virtually anonymously, which is also extraordinary. So we were very fortunate to connect with David in Atlantic. Unfortunately, they did succeed in giving all the money away, so we don't have any more. But that was an incredible boost, and we met with foundations and things like that. And also, this may be boring, but like, who's going to take over for the editor? Who's going to take over for the founder? And so we also have had to have a succession plan, and we have a new president. Her name is Carol Bogert, and I am no longer running it on the daily basis. I have, I can come here and I can do other things. And so hopefully, we've built a brand, we've built an identity, and we'll be around for a while. But let's go back to the original mission. Have we succeeded in that? The original mission was not to have George Williams be able to have a barbershop, which is actually a very valuable thing in itself, but that wasn't the idea. The idea was to elevate the issue of criminal justice to one of national urgency. Or to put it another way, what I would say is, I want to increase the number of people who give a shit about criminal justice reform. That's really all it is. And there I'd say, well, events kind of overtook us. So even before we had published, you had the events in Ferguson where a African-American kid, unarmed, was shot, killed by police, and there were demonstrations in that wake, and there were other police incidents that really focused, and the Black Lives Matter movement came about. And also, in the last couple of years of President Obama's administration, and I will not claim credit for this, but I'll claim some, because I think the Marshall Project, not only for what we did, but I think we also pushed other news organizations to cover this a lot more. The last couple of years of the Obama administration, he really did focus on some meaningful reforms. I don't know if you read this, but they said they were going to phase out federal contracts with federal prisons, which is about 10% of the population, for-profit prisons. The federal government was no longer going to use for-profit business. That was a massive reform. Attorney General Holder, when he was Attorney General, had all these sentencing reform, which is very important. So the march of history was really on our side, and I think we helped. I think if we hadn't been around, most of this would have happened anyway. But I do feel that the Marshall Project is seen in that world, in the world of people who give a shit about criminal justice, as being a very positive force. So I would say we were successful in that way. So there's a question that came up when I had breakfast with David this morning. I asked the question, I'm going to answer it. Would I start the Marshall Project today? Let's just say status quo, there's no Marshall Project. And I'll tell you the truth, and this is relevant to Trump. In 2013, 2014, we were living in a very different world. In my world, we were living in a world where government could do good, where things were more or less improving, not for everyone, but the march of history was favorable, and that things, I felt certain possibilities. And I don't want to bring you guys down because you're younger and you're going out in the world, and I really hope everyone here fulfills their own dreams and aspirations and sets the world on fire. But I find the things going on right now very depressing, and it's sapping my own energy. I'm not proud of this. But I would say it would be harder for me, not you, to start the Marshall Project today, because you have Attorney General Sessions, who's rolling back so many things that the last administration did. This is actually to stimulate you, and this should probably enervate people, but to me, it's like, I got to pause and say, no, but that's the truth. The truth is it's very hard when you see all this work that's being undone. Now, I'm exaggerating a little. You should know 90% of criminal, people who are incarcerated are in state prisons, and the things that are happening on the ground in state and local governments that are very positive. And the Marshall Project is still out there, and we're still doing amazing work. But I do feel that that I was probably affected indirectly by President Obama's administration, frankly. And I want to just give you two anecdotes that sort of might be instructive. When we when we were starting the Marshall Project, it was before we published, I was at a fundraiser for President Obama. It was in somebody's home, and like 30 people in the room. It was amazing. And this is March 2014. And I said, President Obama, I'm Neil Barsky from the Marshall Project. By any chance, in the last 2 years of your administration, did you think maybe you'd want to devote it to criminal justice reform? And da-da-da-da-da. It was almost a commercial for the Marshall Project. And he listened to me. And then he gave a 15-minute answer that sounded like it had come from someone who had thought about nothing but criminal justice reform his entire life. And he talked about things that I was dazzled. He was dazzling. He talked about prison rape, which you would never hear, in a respectful, mature way. And the horror of that and the absurdity of that. And anyway, I was blown away at just how engaged and smart, and this is one of 20 questions he answered. And I left feeling pretty good. And I do feel that he did follow through on many things, not everything, but many things. Fast forward 2 years, I was at a fundraiser for Hillary Clinton. And I raised my hand, and I say, Secretary Clinton, asked some criminal justice question, and she gave such a profoundly disappointing answer. Not that it was the wrong answer. It was just something that was just something out of a, what do you call it? Just out of a, something that she hadn't. It was well prepared. It was completely unspontaneous. It was completely BS, and I really felt like this is a person who was not, had not engaged, had not given it a lot of thought, and certainly wasn't about to do anything courageous. She might have anyway, but anyway, those are just my presidential anecdotes. My Trump anecdote would be, I would just refer you to this article I wrote, but, and I think maybe my, my lack of engagement or my bad mood is as much to do with my own engagement with him, because I wrote about 100 to 200 articles with Trump. I interviewed him dozens of times, and as I said, I'd broken many of the stories that took place when he was on the way down. And again, I'll refer to the article, but for some reasons I don't want to go into, but I can another time. I stopped covering him in 1993, 94, and then he had a financial recovery, and then he had The Apprentice, and then ran for president, and now he's president. And this is true of a lot of people who covered him. Like, we all feel like if only we had done a better job 30 years ago, this wouldn't have happened. And on some level we're wrong, we're grandiose, and on some level we're right also. So I have a particular, it sticks in my craw. But anyway, I just want to go through one last thing, which is what we did wrong with the Marshall Project and what our challenges were. And I would say every situation is unique. In journalism, there's a particular ethos that there's a wall between the editors and the business people, right? So you hire an editor, you hire a great editor, and then he or she does what they want. And so I would say it's very challenging when you have a mission, criminal justice reform, and then you have independence. So how do those two sides, relate to each other? I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but there are issues like diversity and hiring and voice and advocacy that I wouldn't say we made a mistake on, but I would say that's a challenge that we always have to work on. And also I'd say a lot of the funders do not understand journalism. I'm generalizing, but I would say, for example, the Silicon Valley funders by and large don't fund journalism because they're from the technology world. They want results. They want to elect this DA or change this law, and we don't do that. Right? We're just changing consciousness sometimes. We're just changing impressions, with a long-term view of changing the world. And so we have not succeeded yet in penetrating that world. And then there's another issue for us, which is, how many articles do people want to read about falsely incarcerated people or police brutality? I mean, eventually you're going to have reader fatigue and writer fatigue. So should we write about other things? Should we write about poverty? Should we write about immigration? There are all these concentric circles that are related to criminal justice. Should we write about race? The answer to all those things is yes, but we have to navigate that. It so happens that, and I think this is public, that Lorene Powell Jobs is very interested in immigration reform. And they have funded us, and we have an immigration reporter. And not everything they write is directly about criminal justice. But anyway, so I'm going to wind it down now. I sort of touched on a lot of things, and I'm happy to take your questions. And or if not, I can just keep talking. But anyway, thanks.
Thank you. What about big systemic? Because a lot of what Marshall Kleppman writes about is about individual stories, but those individual stories are nested into a system. Right? Sure. So what about systemic change, whether it's at the federal level, if your objective is to get criminal justice reform enacted or addressed at the federal level, you're also focusing on state and local. Tell us a little bit about bigger picture.
If David was not polite, he would say this. Well, Neil, when you thought of the Marshall Project, there were 2.25 million people behind bars in America. Today, there are 2.25 million people behind bars. So how do you measure your impact if ultimately what we want to do, this is me personally, not the Marshall Project, is you want to have a more fair and just society, and so, you know, and so I would say that the world is changing, actually, and I would say it's changing in part. I can answer you, but I don't want to sound too grand, but I would say, let's just take the medium level. In Attica, as I said, there are now cameras in all the hallways, so that means there'll be less brutality, and that will affect not one but many people. But I know what you're saying. Or the article about rape may change the way police deal with victims of sexual crimes. So those are big things. Or the Michelle Jones story that we talked about may, if it gets out there more, really affect the way we think of people who did something terrible, but who now are trying to rebuild their lives. So those are not policy issues, but I know that's not what you're asking. But I would say it's more than just the haircut guy. It's a little broader than that. Fair. On a larger basis, I think that there's a couple of trends and counter-trends. Certainly, as I said, the Attorney General, I think the President is very ineffective at most things, but he's been very effective in criminal justice reform. And I think Sessions is, notwithstanding all the noise, he has succeeded in dismantling many things like sentencing reform on Holder's part. Obviously, the appointment of federal judges and U.S. attorneys is very important. So this is beyond our control, obviously. But I think there is a broad consensus is way too strong, but there's a trend in America that also includes what we would call libertarian conservatives, the Koch brothers, that the Marshall Project writes about a lot, promotes a lot, and that mass incarceration got too far. There are many people who never convicted of violent crime who are spending 5, 10, 20 years in prison. Obviously, the war on drugs, not obviously, but was a big failure, although Sessions disagrees with that, unfortunately. So I would say the march of history is still positive. On the state and local level, you have a lot of more progressive prosecutors being elected or appointed. But this gets back to the federal level where where the President and the Attorney General have the bully pulpit. This is very disappointing. Having said that, I'll give you another sort of story that's a little out of school. Jared Kushner, everyone knows who Jared Kushner is, right? He's married to the president's daughter, and he's got a seat at the White House, and he's very, very influential in policy. Jared Kushner's father, Charlie Kushner, does anyone know what happened to Charlie Kushner? What?
He ended up in prison?
Yeah. Jared Kushner's father spent 2 years in federal prison. And every weekend, Jared visited his father. Jared Kushner's father, Charlie, and I and Jared met 3 years ago to raise money for the Marshall Project. And his father, who is a real estate mogul, who spoke very warmly of what we were doing, who only employs, and not only, but employs many, many formerly incarcerated men, who gave us some help, but not a lot. But anyway, I got to know Jared Kushner a little before any of this happened. And Jared had known about the Trump stuff, so we talked, ha-ha. And it's funny because he has this whole email controversy now, but I emailed him like in January before the president was sworn in his old address, and he got it. And I was like, hey, what's up? Are you guys going to really deliver? Because both of them were talking like they're huge reformers back when we were talking. And he says, yes, we're going to tackle this. And then his email doesn't work for me anymore. But I only say this because they actually, I'm very cynical, so don't take this at face value. But there is a chance, a remote chance, but we're hearing that Trump will, or the Justice Department will tackle, reform. And by reform, it means changing federal guidelines for certain crimes, federal crimes, and basically lowering the sentences. So I would say, in general, the last year has been very disappointing. It's not without hope. But I would say, at the end, I actually feel the Marshall Project has been, huge is too big a word, because I don't think we're well known enough. Like, I don't think we have the reach yet. But I think that we have made an impact in Washington, among advocates, and among other reporters. And so that all other coverage of criminal justice has increased also because of us. I can't prove that, but I'm pretty sure of it. Anyway, any questions? Yes, sir.
So related to this question about broader impact, it's about focus and how you cover certain stories. So there recently was a really good story that I like by Emily Bazelon in the New York Times Magazine called Department of Justification. And it's when I read it, it struck me that there aren't a whole lot of stories like that, because it's a story about an institution, about the Department of Justice, the so-called Department of Justification. So what would be your take on how to cover institutions rather than people or individual stories?
That's a very good question. There's two answers. One is, the reason you don't read more of those stories is they're very expensive, right? She probably worked a year on that story. And there are very few newspapers that have the staff or the money to fund that. So the New York Times is one of them. The LA Times pretty much has eviscerated its own reporting staff. And you probably wouldn't have found that in the LA Times. You might have found that in the Washington Post. We're a nonprofit, so one of the reasons we even exist is we can go to somebody and say, look, you have a civic, like there's a value in journalism and certain kinds of investigative reporting or long-form reporting no one else can do. There's other nonprofits, if you know ProPublica, Center for Investigative Reporting, but that's not the direct answer to your question, but that's one reason that kind of story is so rare. Even the New York Times, which has really stayed the course in terms of investing heavily on high-quality reporting, so that's why it's rare to read that anywhere. Now, how do you cover an institution is really interesting, because let's face it, if I talk about Michelle Jones, who was in prison and had her acceptance rescinded from Harvard, so holy shit, that's a great story. If we talk about how misguided the Department of Justice is, how many people read that story? I mean, it's boring. It's very hard to write about institutions that way. And I don't have a good answer. We do that. We have a long story about the conservative. I've mentioned this already. I think we write too much about it, frankly, because I don't think it's as big a deal as sometimes people want to make it. But the conservative criminal justice reform movement and all these evangelical Christians who see from a perspective of compassion, or libertarians who see too big government, or fiscal conservatives who see the government wasting money. So we write about that. That's institutional. But it's you mentioned the writer, Emily Bazelon. She's like an extraordinarily good writer. It's very hard to write about that stuff and not be boring. And sometimes it's that simple. Like, you can be in a story meeting, and again, I'm the chairman. I don't have anything to do with like story ideas or story selection, but we have a pretty good editor. But often people will talk about ideas, nobody's going to read that, and that's hard. So you have to have a great writer to make it come alive, but also resources. And don't underestimate how expensive journalism is, because it's time. Like, for every story that gets written, there's one that, you spend 3 months on something and it doesn't pan out. So one of the reasons there is a Marshall Project is that there's been this crunch, this complete implosion of professional journalism. So you need more nonprofits and state reporting is really what's been hurt, right? People don't cover, in California, I'm sure there are some good blogs that do, but what do you think is going on in Idaho right now, or North Dakota, or Tennessee? I mean, where they don't have local reporting staffs, I think state reporting has really declined the most. Yes?
How do you avoid readers' fatigue or oversaturation of criminal justice coverage, especially in the long term of like systemic change, which I would suspect would be more like a linear progress?
How do we avoid reader fatigue? And what's the second part?
or reader fatigue / oversaturation of criminal justice?
Well, I'm not sure we do. We don't have 10 million hits a day. You know, we're not BuzzFeed. We're not. I'm not sure we do. But the answer is to do things differently, and we are starting to do things differently. For example, we started as a very traditional journalism organization. We weren't publishing something, but we were words. We were text-based. We didn't have a video department. We had good graphics, and we had very talented designers, but we were basically, our bread and butter was that big 4,000-word piece about the guy that was executed who didn't do it. And if you have patience and you read it, and if it's written well, you'll read it like this, but there's just so many of those you can do. So we are starting to invest more in video projects. And on Thursday, we're coming out with a series called We Are Witnesses. And it's a video series. We're doing it with the New Yorker. And I kind of, you know, launched it. And all it is, not all, it's, I felt that, right, we could talk about policy and we can talk about the big picture. But I also feel that the real reason we're able to sleep at night with 2.5 million people behind bars is that we dehumanize them in such a way that it's okay, right? Those are bad people, they're scary people. And I've also spent a lot of time visiting prisons as part of my work, and I've also come to the realization that that is, as an institution, the most secretive institution we have in this country. It's like maybe the Pentagon or the Federal Reserve Bank. But in general, that one of the goals I would like us to have, or maybe do something else, is open the prisons to public scrutiny and public engagement even. So the Witnesses is an attempt on finding people who represent, no one represents everybody, but not just people who are incarcerated, not just, you know, but the mother of the person who's incarcerated, the mother of the crime victim, the person who committed a crime, the guard, the cop, and show a sort of look at the ecosystem of criminal justice, the prosecutor, the public defender, and show basically, well, what I wanted to do is just sort of humanize everybody, and then in so doing, you know, show the flaws in the system. But what I think we wound up doing, because we found fairly extraordinary people, is we found the nobility of people. You know, we found a guy that had been stabbed by a gang within an inch of his life. His life was destroyed. It was just a random stabbing, like you have to kill somebody. And 15 years later, he's in tears, saying he'd like to shake the guy's hand, hope he has a job, and that he could only recover, he could only get his own life back when he was able to have peace with this person. Or we met a guard at Rikers, which is this notorious jail in New York, an African-American guy who said that he was coming out of church when he was 13, he had a Game Boy in his pocket, and the cops pulled a gun on him, and he was almost shot, and he says, I had to go into law enforcement, I had to beat him or join him. But then he's in Rikers and he's a guard, and he talks about self-defense. And he talks about the terrors of being a guard and the abuse guards get. And I don't doubt him for a second. And so it gives you sort of this weird, so anyway, hopefully it'll be successful. It'll come out, people will watch it, it'll humanize, who knows. It's very hard to reach people. It's very hard to reach, you know, you can explode a watermelon, or Eminem could do a rap about Trump, but how many, you know, how many videos go unwatched, how many articles go unread? It's very hard. So it's a very good question. I don't have an easy answer, but we're trying to do more with video. You have to be innovative. You have to take chances. It's a big question. It's a journalism question, really.
So, you know, the long form was kind of, it sounds like, and I don't know, everything that Marshall Project's been up to is central to how you're trying to get the message out. And that's, you know, not necessarily new methods, since you're trying to, even as David described, you're trying to keep alive a particular way of storytelling that has gone by the wayside. Why choose long form as the way to accomplish the goal of bringing this issue to the top versus the alternatives that have been propagating in lots of different ways these days?
Well, I would say it's not either or. First of all, I don't think anything has an impact of a good, well-reported story that is long and does not insult the reader's intelligence and doesn't take shortcuts and gets both sides. And I still believe, and maybe it's my generational thing, but I still actually believe in the power of that is you can't compare it with anything else. Having said that, you need people's attention. What if no one's reading your stuff, right? People don't always want to read 10,000 word stories. And so, as I said, we're doing other things in video. But you know what? If you look at our traffic, what sometimes gets the best hits The light stuff. We had a story about, it was called Fake Up, and it's about the way women in prison take food and powders and have makeup, and how they try to look well. And what's the site now that we partnered with? It had 500,000 hits. People here would know it. I can't remember it. It catered to teenage girls.
Teen Vogue.
No, but Teen Vogue we've done stuff with also, and Teen Vogue is very political, and they do other stuff. No, this is a one word. It'll come to me later. But anyway, or we did a thing on prison food. And that's not going to change people's mind about, but it actually humanizes anyway. So those get traffic. The way I put it is you have dessert, you have meat, you have vegetables, you have alcohol, you have, and you need a mixture. We can't just serve we can't just serve broccoli every day, right? And we need to have a mixture, and that's true of all journalism outfits. We've probably been a little, what I would observe is that in digital journalism, if you look at successful digital journalism or outfits, look at BuzzFeed or Huffington Post or Gawker in the old days. People familiar with these names? More or less, yes. So they all started down here. Gawker was a gossip site, Huffington Post was an aggregator, BuzzFeed was like listicles and cat videos. And they said, oh, wait a minute, let's get taken seriously. And they climbed up, and they were taken more seriously by doing more serious journalism. We started way up here with page one stories in the New York Times and Washington Post. And we need to get down here because you need a big audience. And so I think it's a good question. It's a balancing act. But also has to do with our skill level and what we know best. I think we could afford to take more risk, along those lines and tell stories differently. Definitely. Yes?
How can you convince people who kind of have a conditioned response or tendency to dehumanize those who have been in prison to shift their perspective a bit? What's like the best argument beyond the emotional side, which is powerful, but I'm just curious, what's the best argument beyond that?
Well, putting aside the journalism disclaimer that our goal is we're not really trying to change anyone's mind about this, putting that BS thing, I would say you've identified a challenge. I put it a different way. The challenge for us to reach people who care about criminal justice and already for reform, we can do that pretty easily. How do we reach police officers and corrections officers and red states and things like that? And that's what you're talking about. How do you take those people and change? So first, it's like the song, if I can meet him, I can get him, but as yet I haven't met him. Like, we got to find him, and that's really hard. Finding the New Yorker, NPR, New York Times crowd, that's not hard. So we try, and we reach out to organizations and policemen's organizations, and we try to even publish articles by people from law enforcement, just so we can have a whole community of people reading what we're doing. Ultimately, if you're really talking about how do you change people's minds about something that scares us so much and really is at our core, that's a cosmic question, and you have to believe in you basically have to believe in humanity. Like, if I spent 2 days in San Quentin. I don't know if people are familiar with San Quentin. It's outside of San Francisco. It's a notorious, famous prison, but it also is embedded in Marin County, which is a very liberal county. And we went there was doing something, and there's a newspaper there, and we met the guys who work on the newspaper, and some of them have published for us. And we spent 2 days there. I gave a TEDx talk. I met 20, 30 men, and I left blown away. I left blown away by the humanity, B, the waste of lives, and it was this exposure that actually changed a lot of what you're hearing today. So that's why I said we should have people exposed. Now, there are bad people. There are people who you trust that will stab you in the back. There are people who you can, who will be released on parole and do bad things. I mean, but ultimately, you have to believe that people are basically decent, and basically, when you remove fear, which is something I didn't talk a lot about, which is a very real and rational thing when it comes to crime. When you remove fear and you remove bigotry, which is a lot harder, then I feel that exposure is one way is by humanizing people and exposing one to the other. But that probably sounds naive. Yes?
What were some of the biggest challenges that you think you faced transitioning from working on Wall Street and being so involved in the business world to moving to the nonprofit sector?
Well, first of all, it's been great. Like, I don't miss the business world, and I enjoyed when I was there, and so overall, no regrets. But I would say it's actually, I was going to talk about this. The culture of Wall Street and the culture of nonprofits are very different. And guess what? Nonprofits aren't better necessarily. I would say people return your phone calls more in business than in the nonprofit world. They are actually sometimes less entitled. Like if we're writing a 10-page proposal to somebody and maybe they don't respond, that there is this sort of inefficiency, I hate to use that word, that you often find, not always, in the nonprofit world. Whereas like Wall Street is kick-ass. Like I have an assistant, she's worked with me for 20 years, she worked with me at Morgan Stanley. She cannot believe some of the stuff that she sees now, okay? Because she comes from a culture where shit gets done. And I would say, frankly, the nonprofit world, and it's a generalization, so with that caveat, is not run as well. Universities, I taught at college, are not usually run as well. Now, there are other things. They're more humane. They're less cutthroat. They have a mission. But when you're incented by money, frankly, and there's one incentive, and everyone feels the same incentive and feels the harder they work, the more they'll make, it's run better. I'm not saying that's the right way to do things, because there's a lot of other things involved. So I think it's been, as a manager, much harder in the nonprofit world. And when I was running a hedge fund, it's like, I was the boss. Guess what? And I paid people. So people did what I wanted, which isn't necessarily the best thing, but it's the way it was. And nonprofits are it's actually, you hit on something, because it's a lot harder to run a nonprofit well, to manage. Egos are different, et cetera. Yes?
I have an inflammatory kind of question, so bear with me when I ask. So how do you create longevity for projects like the Marshall Project? Because for me personally, quite frankly, I just don't think that the topics that are covered by the Marshall Project can afford to lose attention or longevity in the long run. So I think you've touched on it.
Well, obviously, if criminal justice wasn't such a scandal, then we'd be out of business, and that'd be wonderful. But no one here expects that to happen anytime soon. I don't know if you're asking an editorial question or a administrative question. Like I said, editorially, you just have to stay fresh. And I think where you're going to see us start covering things that are ancillary to criminal justice, like race, like immigration, like poverty, like education, maybe not, so we have to broaden our but I'll tell you, the best, I would bet, and I'm not an expert in the nonprofit world, but I bet the best nonprofits not the best, nonprofits fail, my guess, is not because they don't know their mission, but because they don't know how to run themselves. And it's much harder to run it well than have a mission. Like I said, anybody in this room can have 20 great ideas, and running it's really hard. Because I come from something of a business background, I like to think I had a bit of an advantage. And the person we have running it now is also she worked in the nonprofit and the journalism world, but that is everything. And my guess is, in our place, everybody wants to be a reporter. Everybody wants to be on the fun side, right? That what we're doing is not fun. Asking for money is not fun. And I'm sure there's, analogous things in every nonprofit. So you want to make sure that you have talent on both sides of the organization is what I guess the answer is. Yeah.
Kind of going off what she was saying, like it's easy for, even if it's like a really good story, to kind of just like keep scrolling and then forget about it, and like it might have touched you, but to like not do anything about it. Right. So I'm wondering, when you do get a lot of publicity on a story, do you do anything to trying to like further the conversation? Like, do you raise money? Do you direct people to donate somewhere? Like,
boy, that's, again, you hit another nail on the head. The answer is sometimes. There is a school of journalism that's impact journalism that will I don't know if Mike does this, or what's the one that's I'm blanking out, but there are other organizations that if you want to help, this is what you should do, or if you want to do this. And I would say that's antithetical to the culture of our editors. And it's just, it's like they're not used to relating to audiences in the same way as people do today. Now, having said that, we did this amazing investigation on the prison transport industry. So when people go from one state to another, they're often, not often, usually to go to prison, they're usually in a private company van. Like the state will hire a private prison van company to do it. And guess what? They suck. They're dangerous. They're inefficient. They're like not a little dangerous. People die. And it's like completely unregulated. And one of the things we're proudest of, we did this investigation and there was a federal investigation and things are changing in that industry. And one of the things we did, to answer your question, was how can you investigate your own state's private prison, a private transport thing? I don't know what came of it. But I don't think we do a lot of that, and it's harder in criminal justice. I mean, in fairness, it's harder. I would like, but I'm not. It's a cop out. I would say we don't do that. Yes.
Are there any platforms? Like I know that you mentioned that you kind of want to move away from the people. I mean, not move away, but target other like readers other than those who like read NPR, because those are obviously individuals who already care. Are there any platforms that you think are more effective in reaching those target, whether it be print or social media? Like which platforms are you utilizing?
I don't know if it's about platforms. I mean, even USA Today, which is probably read by nobody, but it's certainly not the elite. You know, it's not. So we've been trying to partner with places like USA Today. We've been trying to partner with local papers in red states. We've been trying to find police benevolent associations, and there are Facebook pages of cops, and you know, it's hard, but it's not a matter of the platform. I don't think it's just the population. On the other hand, you know, you have a page one story in the New York Times. There's nothing like it for impact. There's nothing like that. Half the people here had heard Michelle Jones' story and maybe didn't even read it in the Times, but knew about it. If we hadn't partnered with the Times, I really doubt that would have been the case.
You know, in terms of partnerships, so now we're seeing journalists who used to be exclusively print from the Atlantic, from the New York Times, from the Washington Post, on CNN, MSNBC, in some cases Fox News. Do Marshall Project journalists do that kind of?
You have to be up very late at night, but you'll see us. Yeah. No, absolutely. When we have a big story and we have a publicity department and we go on NPR and TV, and our reporters have all been on MSNBC being the most, or NPR being the most common. But we don't have any, I don't think anyone now with a regular gig on TV. Be nice, but we don't. But we would. Be happy to.